So we are back with Dan Quinn.
Dan
on
knows what's
campus.
coming, I think.
He does. Were
Totally.
we doing this dumb stuff the last time we interviewed you?
We hadn't got to that point yet.
Yeah.
No.
You do this for a while, and too much windshield time maybe gets you to the point where
I think our podcast
happen.
talking about corn stunt was maybe I think it was our first one where we started this fun stuff where you filled us in part 2 about some of your
Well, things in my personal life.
Yeah.
2025 was a challenging year. I'm super excited about the management conversation today because obviously we learned a lot in 2025, and we're about to start the process of getting excited about growing a corn crop again. But to introduce our show, we've done a few of these now, and welcome back to A Penny for Your Thoughts. We're on the Purdue campus. It's actually cool. We're at what's this facility called?
Indiana Corn and Soybean Innovation Center.
Yep. Awesome facility.
It's a really cool facility. Out the glass wall, a bunch of the students and people doing research are eating lunch right now. It's a pretty cool time. But here with my co-host Andrew Penney, I am Sean Blomgren. I pride myself in my Jenga and shoots and ladder skills. I don't mind that one.
That one's not as bad, is it?
Yeah. Shoots and ladders is a fun game. I like board games.
I love shoots and ladders.
Yeah. Shoots and ladders I probably haven't played in 25 years. So.
I play shoots and ladders by myself in my hotel room with Fabrizio, which is my imaginary friend that we learned about in the last episode. So
right.
I win every time. It's phenomenal.
I think that's going to be my favorite.
Fabrizio?
Yeah. Your imaginary friend named Fabrizio.
Playing shoots and ladders in the hotel. Gotta find ways to entertain ourselves. But
there may be some insights into that, that's the topic for another conversation later.
Yeah.
Looking forward
the human psychology of
whether it's environmental or just with all these changes, Dan, you brought up the advancements we're making in breeding, this rate of genetic gain, some of the cool stuff we're doing that these companies are doing in the background. A lot of excitement and I think some fun conversation that we're going to have around managing corn, right? Some's changed, some's adapted, or we've adapted, whether it's trying to increase yield, increase ROI. A lot of cool stuff going on in the corn realm, we'll say. Let's start with 30,000-foot view. What do you learn in terms of maybe some management practices, or what do you see in 2025 that maybe stood out, good or bad?
I think we kind of alluded to this earlier, about, the fundamentals again. It's the way they stand out, every year and in challenging years, I would say probably more so in challenging years. It's like, man, that continues to be an important aspect. And one thing that I always point to and also amazes me with trials, right, is the genetics piece. We have the fortunate aspect to be able to work with a lot of different hybrids across a lot of different brands and a lot of different germplasms out there. And they might be in the same field and they might have the same relative maturity, and one might yield 40 bushel difference than the other. So the adaptability and the way they behave in certain environments, I think, corn genetics is such an important piece, but how much it varies, right? And that, we know it, but it's also just an eye-opening aspect to a lot of what we do in our trials. We've really tried to hone into a lot of, these intensive management practices, but maybe how they relate to some of the genetics and very contrasting genetics, right? And whether it be their root development or their stature, or these aspects, or, their ear development and stuff like that. So maybe is there anything we can maybe fine tune in certain practices that maybe fit one genetic piece versus another? So I think that's an important piece, something that, again, stands out to me. I always come back to sulfur, stands out to me. We had, pretty significant sulfur responses again this year. And also just understanding the dynamics of sulfur and sources and timing and those things. And then, disease control. I think Iowa was a lot worse than we were, but that southern rust, one was a challenge in a lot of areas, and we had tar spot in areas, and I think in Northeast Indiana we helped a farmer and took some samples and we sent them through our diagnostic lab, and I didn't tell him this lightly that he won the lottery, but I think he had 6 or 7 diseases on his diagnostic report. So some of those, I would say, the forgotten diseases, gray leaf spots and northern core leaf blights that we deal with year in and year out. So a lot of those fundamental pieces, the production, the fertility, we've been doing shift a lot of work into potassium realms, just the importance of potassium, and that's a nutrient too that not just in Indiana but in a lot of areas has been decreasing over time, and there's actually been some published papers on potassium nutrition in humans, right, in the U.S. humans, and looking at that, and it being deficient in the crops, and actually how that translates to a human standpoint and nutrition standpoint. I think some of those maybe get forgotten about and maybe put aside to some of these progressive practices, but then you kind of have challenging years or years where maybe stuff's a little bit tighter and harder, and you kind of start to look at and appreciate those fundamentals a lot more.
It's interesting you mentioned they stand out more in a more difficult year. It's certainly the genetics piece, absolutely, and I think in a challenging year you really see that, right? I mean, in a couple pretty good growing seasons the last couple of years, everything kind of looks good.
Yep.
And then in these challenging years that you really start to see a separation. I know for us you feel a lot more vulnerable in those years because you go, holy cow, the recommendations we make can have a pretty significant impact, right?
Yeah.
So in our science episode you guys hit on this idea of duration and rate of grain fill. So when we think about management, but both I would call it traditional management maybe, or just standard management, but then high yield management, what are the ways we can impact that grain fill?
I think it all kind of relates back to the overall health, and just the I always mention that corn when it's at silking and those grain fill early grain fill stages, and in many ways it's a machine, right? It's a photosynthetic machine, so maintaining that photosynthetic machine is an important aspect to it, and that's why you think we did a lot of work on fungicides and disease control and grain fill duration, but you look at our results, in many ways they relate to the nitrogen work that like Dr. Tony Fine did here at Purdue. Having adequate nitrogen fertility can influence the grain fill duration and controlling the disease, and you bring the environmental factor. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing that influences grain fill and grain fill duration. You think about when we have cooler. 2023 was a really good example of just massive kernels and just an extended grain fill. We had much cooler falls, and that plant just wasn't drying down. It wasn't senescing, and that grain fill duration was just a lot longer period. So I think there's a lot of external factors, but it really comes back to, okay, how do we kind of maintain the overall health of that plant and kind of keep it going later in the season? Because you think about, whether it be nutrition, disease control, a lot of those things, if they're not, managed correctly, what are they doing on the back end of the season, right? It's getting deficient. Okay, that plant, it's running out of steam, right? It's that plant just doesn't have enough to finish. Disease aspect, right? We let that disease keep going, right? It's going to overtake the green leaf area. It's going to shut down the photosynthetic capacity of that plant, and then that plant's just going to kind of shut down and senesce. So how do you kind of keep it going a little bit longer?
It's anecdotal. I don't have research to back these claims up, but I do feel like we've seen a lot more interest in some of the foliar nutritional products going out with, tassel and even post-tassel fungicide applications, and starting to see a lot of data from the companies trying to sell them. So I'm not, I'm
guaranteed 15 bushel.
Buyer beware. But I guess what you're talking about, right? So we've talked about in the science episode the importance of how starter fertilizer impacts the root and the plant physiology. But I guess I'm thinking, so if I've pulled a lot of those levers and I've done a lot of things right up until that point, I'm starting to run out of opportunities, right, when I'm into those reproductive stages. But when you're talking about keeping that plant healthy I just wonder if that's not maybe where there's an opportunity if I've done everything else right, sometimes I think we think about those almost like rescue treatments, right? Like, oh, I have a deficiency, so maybe I need to go respond to the deficiency. When you're talking about that, I'm thinking of it the opposite. Maybe if everything has gone well, that's when I should use those types of products to really just drag that grain flow out as long as possible. Is there merit in that, or am I being a salesman?
That's something we've actually started to dive into now. That's the next step we've gone. Is that okay? What if we combine some of these fertility? Because I was getting the same questions, right?
Yeah.
What if we include? And we've actually done I think 5 or 6 trials, looking at, fungicide with, something like, big one is, boron, the potassium, stuff like that. You think about how something like boron influences, pollination and those things. And, surprisingly, and, we've seen, improvements with some of this foliar fertility. Now we have to dive into a lot more and try and understand it and see if there's something there. But it was enough to go, okay, maybe there's something going on here. So a lot of that grain fill work we're still doing, and so the next step of that was to look at it with, keep doing the fungicide. I think this year we had, multiple fungicides, early fungicides, late fungicides with that component, but also adding a fertility piece to it, because we did some just field scale trials of, hey, let's just do, replicated field scale trials. Let's put, fungicide with fertility, no fungicide, right, and replicate it across, I think we did in 4 sites in Indiana. And it was enough to go, okay, I think maybe there's something going on here. It's just something that we need to learn about more. But yeah, that was a big question I was getting. It was also a question I had. So I do think there's potentially some merit in looking at that fertility piece. Some of these maybe micronutrients or macronutrients that we can use it at these fungicide application timings, right? You're making that pass anyway, right?
Yeah.
But is there some added benefit from it? And from a yield standpoint, we have some indication that there is a benefit from it, and now we're just trying to understand it a lot more.
Thinking about we got we're talking about management, so we're kind of going to merge weed science with corn growth and development in management. What's your thoughts on using cover crops as a weed suppression, and then also obviously what's the impact on potential corn?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of cover crop work. A big part of my PhD was cover crop work in front of corn. One thing that always stood out to me, and it depends on the cover crop, right? We do a lot of work with cereal rye. That's kind of the I'd say the poster child of the cover crops, right? But one things that always stood out to me was the weed control aspect of it. We could see to the line where we had that cover crop, even in a no-till situation, where that cover crop was and where it wasn't, right? So I think, a lot of those grass cover crops, those cover crops that give you a decent amount of biomass, right, they do a great job in controlling some of those early season weeds. Now, can you skip out on, the weed science guys will call me and hurl stuff at me if you
Tommy's coming on
Tommy's
after.
coming in. Yeah, you're gonna get in trouble.
Now, can you skip a pre, right? They would throw things at me. You can't get away with some of that. But in terms of just kind of keeping some of those pressures low in the spring, that was always something that stood out to us when we did these trials. But there's challenges with that, right? The more biomass we have, again, corn is just sensitive when it's young.
Corn is a diva.
Corn is a diva.
That's Sean Castile quote right there. But it is, and so when you have added residue out there and stuff like that, we do a lot better with it now because of a lot of it's the planters that we have today. They account for that heavy residue, but we've looked at it. A lot of it's nutrition based, right? Mobilization of nitrogen is big, and it's something we see every single year that we do these trials. That high carbon level that's out there with some of these, something like cereal rye that. You can spread on a gravel lot and it'll grow, but it also can be, in some ways, it grows too good. But it just, influences those nutrient dynamics early in the season. We've really shifted this year to looking at the sulfur piece because we're noticing, we did a lot of work on, the mobilization of nitrogen, how we manage nitrogen in these systems, placements, stuff like that. But when we were doing these trials on nitrogen, we started noticing, hey, there's a lot of S deficiency out here. as well. So we've actually shifted now to looking at sulfur management and these cover crop systems. And I have some really good pictures this year, walking some of our trials where we had, sulfur at planting versus not in these cover crop systems, and it was night and day difference in the sulfur deficiency in those plants. So yeah, it's not a silver bullet, and there's challenges to it, and a lot of it's nutritional. And what I've focused with a lot of people and a lot of our work is, okay, just understanding that you can't manage it the same way in these systems that you were. And start slow and be really careful with, you don't have to go gun-ho and do a cereal rye cover crop and plant green, right? You can use some of those winter kill cover crops or some of these other species a little less, these legumes that are a little safer and stuff like that. But yeah, I think, some of these grass cover crops like a cereal rye do a great job with weed control and helping with that aspect. But I do think, if you're using them to control weeds, right, a lot of times you need that biomass to be able to help with that. And then you look at it from our standpoint of, nutrition and emergence and planning and stuff like that, then, we might run into more issues.
It gives me an idea that we should really probably do an episode at some point on cover crops, if you're going from one end of the extreme to the other, right? Like a conventional till to a cover crop. It'd be fun to pick somebody's brain on that.
Yeah.
I have a customer in the state of Iowa that does a wonderful job with their cover crops. So everything's strip tilled. The weed control piece is interesting because they do plant green. They're 15 years into this process, and it's pretty interesting because they'll go in and they'll plant into tall. It's crazy to watch. I mean, you watch it and you're like, there's no way you can produce corn like this. And then when they do terminate the rye, it all just falls down right in the middle of the row. And I do believe, I don't know if I'm 100% certain of this, but I do think they've had years where they have used no herbicide outside of just to terminate the rye because the rye cover has done such a good job of controlling weeds. So doesn't always work that way. And I do know, you talked about going, just full bore cereal rye. It's interesting because I think it took them 4 or 5 years to really dial in that rate. And boy, when you have too much, it is really, really difficult to compete with.
Really important piece. I think when we started, and even when I started as a grad student, like we were, the rate has dropped quite a bit drastically from where we started till now. But yeah, I think, we have some folks in Indiana, quite a few that are really good at it, and they've been doing it a long time, and it works great for them. The planting green piece is really interesting. I did a lot of work in my PhD on that in corn, and there's some interesting aspects to that too. We were noticing that a lot of the nitrogen issues and mobilization issues weren't happening when that rye was still growing and it was bigger, and it wasn't laying in the soil and breaking down and causing some of that mobilization. But then we had a lot of other issues on the flip side too. I remember one year I went to go rate plots and walked out and chased like 3 possums and a skunk and all this stuff out of my trials, and so they harbor a lot of pests. There's I always say lean on people that have been doing it a long time because they've probably made all the mistakes, and then you can learn from them. But yeah, the big piece is that you have to manage. A lot of times you have to pay a lot more attention to detail in those systems. You have to be a lot more careful. Your timing has to be a lot more critical, and you don't want to manage things the same way in those systems that you do in maybe a conventional tills.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about we've talked a lot about this the last couple of years, just the importance of starter fertilizer. Give us your opinion on if someone wants to adopt that, maybe thinking about in-furrow versus a 2x2.
Yeah, and I think there's pros and cons to both. I tend to lean towards more of whether it be the old school 2x2 with the coulters in the front, right? But they have a lot of fancy different systems out there now. The 2x0s or the 2x2x2 or all these aspects, right, that make it a little bit easier. The reason I tend to lean towards that, right, is one for safety, right? In many cases, it just takes the wrong year, the wrong mix, or something like that to smoke. I've been in those cornfields where they pushed a little bit hard with their in furrow, and the corn is not looking good.
Gets a little hot.
Yeah, gets a little hot. We talk about the importance of root systems, right? That if that radical
bad start.
Yeah, if that radical root emerges into an environment it hates, you're in trouble the rest of the year. So, from that aspect of one, the safety piece, but also that you can get a little bit more, too, especially you look at the nitrogen, sulfur especially, right? We don't want ATS in furrow. We have a lot of problems if we do that, but we can get some, a little bit more on that side. Especially, if, I look at it a lot from a nitrogen perspective, right? Of, hey, if we have a lot of folks in Indiana that want a side dress, right? But we do need adequate nitrogen to get that plant up and going, and carry us to side dress, right? In many cases, that in-furrow application is just not going to give us enough to get to that side dress, especially if we end up getting delayed on our side dress piece. But on the flip side, I think there's some benefits to some of the in-furrows. You think about the micronutrient
zinc
is a really
it's becoming more common.
I think zinc in furrow is a really good practice. It's worked really well for us in a lot of aspects. So some of the micros, some of the more safer products, we've been doing a lot of work on like some of these in-furrow K products and potassium products. We found in some of these more challenging either low K soils or some of our southern Indiana soils that just struggle in general and with K availability, that hey, there may be some potential there in those more challenging K environments that in furrow piece, and some of these are actually made to be in furrow. You just talk about K in furrow and you go, oh my goodness, I wouldn't put K. But they're made for that application. So I think there's pros and cons of both, but I tend to lean towards having something like a 2x2 just because the safety piece and in many cases you can get a little bit more. Now the flip side of that, right, is I think put your farmer hat on, right, you're gonna have to fill up more, right, many times more weight on your planter, and so I understand that side of it. But just in a lot of our work, we see the benefits of having that nutrition at a little bit higher rates at planting. But, I think in furrow has its place when you think about some of these micronutrients and some of these other practices.
Humic or fulvic acids, there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, and I think, open up a can of worms, right, go down the biostimulant route. But I do think, some of those, right, if they're going to work, you have to have it in real close proximity to the seed as well. So I think, there's certain products and practices that kind of fit one or the other. Some of our best farmers in the state, they use both, right? And that's pretty common that they're putting their micros and there's more safe products in the in-furrow, and then they have nitrogen and sulfur in their 2x2.
Dan, quickly talk to me about before my next question. Talk to me about. I was looking over some of your what do you call your articles? Your articles that you send out on a monthly basis from the corn, the corn,
kernel.
Yeah, the kernel. There you go.
Yeah.
I was looking over some of that just to try and get some good ideas on some topics to talk to you about. Yeah. I was pretty fascinated with all the starter fertilizer research you guys did last year, in some of those responses. Man, it obviously comes down to limiting factors, your soil tests. But I think there's also something to concentration, right? And I think that's, again, as our yield potential goes up, that's something that, you look at some of the Iowa State data, the phosphorus response in high phosphorus soils, right? There's just little things. Talk to me about some of the stuff you looked at and some of those responses, because there were some there were some 20 bushel responses.
Yeah.
And the one thing I did notice, it was some pretty high yielding corn, so that's probably part of it too, right? As yield goes up, your research showed the response to starter goes up.
Yeah, and some of it was the in-furrow K, in-furrow potassium stuff. So a lot where that stood from is that we have some locations around the state that we've purposely kept low in terms of soil test potassium, and so we actually just said, hey, why don't we try using some of these in-furrow nutrition on some of these lower testing soils. We had a location where we put it was like super low K, 20, 30 parts per million K, but we let's put different rates of broadcast potash and then overlay that with some of the in-furrow potassium, in that site. If we're going to see a magnitude of response, we're going to see it at that site. And one thing we noticed was, some of the, 20, 30 bushel responses were just to that in-furrow application. So in those really low K sites where we expected a K response to happen, just that small concentration next to the plant caused that level of yield response. But what was also interesting is we overlaid it with broadcast potash rates too. And we had massive responses. One thing I always caveat with that study too is that we had huge responses to potash, period, right? And, if you have low K soils and you add potash, you get big responses. But we did actually also see in those low K soils where we added potash, we were still getting a benefit even at the high rates of broadcast potash with that in-furrow K. So that really stood out to us. We actually drastically expanded that research trial this year and have it at a lot more locations and a lot more soils that aren't, 20, 30 parts per million K.
Yeah.
But, I think there's something to, the concentration and the proximity of some of that nutrition, especially in some of our more challenging soil environments in the state. But yeah, that was something that really stood out to me, and it stood out to some of our other colleagues too. It's like, holy cow, what's going on here?
Yeah.
So that's why we, part of being in research, we see something and we go, okay, well, we got to do it again. We got to do it in more sites and more years. So that's a road we've been going down this year. We have a lot more trials this year, but yeah, that in-furrow potassium piece has really been kind of eye-opening, especially on these really deficient soils. We expected a big K response, but a very small amount of K in furrow, and we're getting 20, 30 bushel off.
Yeah,
of
that's crazy.
That.
Yeah.
You wouldn't
talk about
expect
efficiency.
That. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Dan, building on some of, I remember having you on last, was that almost 2 years ago again? I guess, it's a year and a half, 2 years,
yeah,
probably.
So. Mm-hmm.
I remember you were our first guest, so it probably would have been 2023. You might have been our first, 2024. Mm-hmm. You would have been our first guest. So yeah, we're coming up on 2 years. I remember we talked to you about some of your high yield research trials you were doing, and it was similar to Belo's, but we weren't. You were looking at a multitude, maybe throwing the kitchen sink at some of this stuff.
Yeah.
What did some of that trials look like this year? What would you look at? What products did you look at? How were you thinking about approaching this high yield?
Yeah, we kind of modified a lot of them this year. A lot of it, had to do with my grad student defended and finished, and we wrapped up a lot of her work and published some of it and stuff like that. So we kind of shifted gears a little bit and really took what we learned and translated it to what we're doing now. And one aspect was, so one of the questions was the fungicide with the fertility, right, and those combinations, but adding a little bit more on the fertility piece. Potassium, right, was one that we wanted to start looking at in terms of how that influences pre-plant potassium, or looking at sulfur as well. One thing that we kind of shifted to is, a lot of our studies and farmers, they do sulfur applications at side dress, right? And they mix ATS with their UAN. Yeah. But one thing we were noticing is, we did a lot of this work, is that corn in many cases is already S deficient when we were putting the ATS on. And that
so you need AMS.
Yeah, so we actually shifted to either ATS at, say, with a starter application or an AMS at planting. So kind of taking some of those tweaks out of those studies, and then we also added a genetic piece to it as well. And I know you'll talk to my grad student Eric, but looking at, okay, with say short stature corn, right? If we start overlaying these intensive management practices, and we expanded it more in terms of the omission design, right, where you have everything and you're pulling them out, and you have some and you're adding in. We didn't necessarily have that in our original trials, but now we have that.
Okay, nice.
In these trials, but then having the genetic component to it too, right?
Yeah.
With different hybrids, different statures, as well, to see, is there a realm where, say, a hybrid or a stature that, with these new short stature hybrids, maybe we can, push that envelope a little bit more, or maybe they respond differently, or their interactions are differently from a genetic side as well. So, this year is kind of the first year we kind of, sunsetted a lot of the stuff and kind of took what we learned over the last 3 years and shifted it now to where we can, fine tune some of that and then, keep moving forward with some of the trials now.
Yeah.
But it's It's a piece that we'll probably always be doing. It's a trial that all the farmers enjoy, that we do. They really love. I mean,
those are the fun ones, right?
Yeah, it's always my most requested, topic to talk about at meetings. So it's something we'll always be doing, but I think we'll always be kind of tweaking it based off of what we learn.
Is there one thing you've learned? I love doing just playing around with different things that you think will increase yield on the farm. Mm-hmm. Is there one thing you've done or where you've started just incorporating that into your everyday practice? Is there lessons learned?
I think two that stand out. We talk about the fundamentals, right? But two that stand out and what we learned was sulfur and fungicides, right?
Sulfur and fungicides.
Those were the two big ones that stood out to us as well. But I think the other one that stood out to us when we did some of these preliminary trials was the nutrition with the fungicide, right, that we talked about, that there may be, we haven't moved to, hey, should be standard, but, it was enough to say, hey, maybe there's something there. But, one thing we kind of learned and where we want to keep going is that we started seeing with some of these treatments that you could, when you incorporate, say, population or seeding rates in there too, in many cases on, say, a per plant basis, right, we might lose some of that kernel number, or we might lose some of that kernel weight if we say get up to a higher population. But, if we manage it a little bit harder in these systems or protect a little bit better, you talk about the benefits of fungicides or fertility and kernel weight size. Hey, we do have some indications that maybe we can maybe we're maintaining that kernel number, right? Or we're losing some of that kernel number, but maybe pushing that kernel weight, or that the interactive piece of kernel number and kernel weight on these plants, to seeing hey, can we maybe keep one where it needs to be, and then but continue to push the other, in that envelope. So I'm always fascinated just with the interactions pieces and the way different genetics interact, but way different inputs interact and different management practices interact. I think that's something that always stood out to me, is that, hey, and when you have this genetic and this population and this fertility plan, okay, maybe you see a benefit from this practice, but when you don't, you may not see a benefit from this practice. So
it's fun to bring genetics in when you start looking at our typical racehorse versus workhorse hybrids. And I'm curious, as we continue to advance yield potential, what that looks like, right? Mm-hmm. If we're growing 300 bushel corn, will we still have defensive products? Will it be a good mixture? I feel like we've had those conversations. It seems like it's becoming just a more norm that we have these products that are kind of both. Mm-hmm. And obviously you still have some that, the quick dye and dry versus the one that's going to have the late season stay green. But I'm curious to go where that whole conversation goes in 10 years. I know one of the cool things when I was doing research, it's fun to bring in genetics to the equation, because you learn so much, right? I remember 10 years ago looking at doing some high yield management stuff, a fungicide plus nitrogen side dress, and it was a weird year, but we had a super defensive product and a super offensive product, and it was I can't imagine I'd ever see this again, but it was like a 1 + 1 = 2 with in both hybrids, right? So there's just Mother Nature. There's just so many variables. But bringing in the genetics piece adds to that component. So I think it's going to help you formulate, and all your grad students that are learning from you, help you formulate kind of how they think about, hybrids and all that stuff. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, I think that was the main piece when we looked at, okay, how do we keep doing some of these trials with the genetic piece? And it was something that we got asked about a lot too. Does it, you think about, hybrids that have, smaller kernels but higher kernel numbers versus some that have lower kernel numbers versus higher kernel weights. How does that change things? You bring in the short stature corn piece, how does that change things? So, that was something we didn't have in the original study, is, we had different locations with some different genetics, but actually within the study, having, that genetic, contrasting genetics and seeing how they differentiate with some of these high yield management practices is kind of that next step where we're hoping to go.
Yeah. Well, I know the thing that I appreciate about that is ultimately that's very tangible research, mm-hmm. right? Because, we have to know that. We have to know the genetic component to know if it theoretically translates when we put it into practice.
Yeah.
So
mm-hmm. I'm super excited about your next question.
If we get really good at this and we continue to see high yields like we have this residue conversation, right, that's taking place. And so What was the number that Connor gave us? 44 pounds of residue.
Yep. Every bushel increase we see is 44 pounds of residue, give or take.
So this fall, I sent out. I started selling seed in 2010, and in 2011 on my Facebook, I got one of those Facebook memories or whatever I had posted that we had a whole field that did 200 bushels, and that apparently was noteworthy back in 2010 or 2011.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now 300 isn't out of the question. Maybe in 2025 it was a little bit harder to achieve that. But I guess talk to me a little bit about how you guys are thinking about the residue conversation, and maybe specifically. We're kind of through fall of 2025, but what do we need to start doing commercially right now?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, you know, that's something that, you know, both myself and Sean have really pivoted to paying attention to that because we've really started to notice it. And even out here, you know, at this research farm, you know, we're very fortunate at this research farm that we have the soils that we do, but we push 300 bushels regularly out in this research farm. You know, we have a lot of small plot trials, but we have a lot of field scale trials at this farm too. And we started looking at actually just kind of starting last year, just looking at residue in general, the amounts, you know, what's in the residue, looking at the quality of the residue, and you know the cellulose and all these aspects of it. And yeah, it's, you know, we have data, and I think it pretty much matches what a lot of people have seen, that is that it's a linear relationship. As those yields keep going up, that dry residue on that soil surface is going up as well. And, you know, you think about corn residue, right, and, you know, we touched on this a lot with the cover crop side, the carbon piece, right, it can influence a lot of the nutrition and the immobilization and stuff like that. And I think it's, you know, really impacting a lot of areas, not only from just the sheer amounts of it, but also just the spread of it, right? I think that's a big piece. You know, combines today are so much better than what they were, but they're a lot bigger.
Yeah, heads are getting bigger, right?
It's hard to spread a lot of residue across a 16-row head, right, on a machine, or, you know, you think about the giant soybean. You know, we talk a lot about corn residue, right? We're seeing a lot of issues too in soybean residue.
Oh yeah,
you know, impacting
with even
corn.
bigger heads.
Yeah, you know, so, you know, not only the just sheer amounts of it, but just the spread of it. Just trying to get it out of the back of that machine as well, because we're even seeing, you know, looking at last fall, you know, having, you know, 300 bushel corn, trying to spread that residue. You know, it was vertical tilled in the fall, and, you know, did everything we could to help it in the spring, but we were still seeing issues in the spring. We were able to get some really good drone imagery that you can see it, still see in season where that combine was going through. So, yeah, I think that's a really critical piece as we keep, and it's only going to become more and more of a challenge as well. I think, you know, Indiana is you know, unique. That Indiana is a heavy rotation state, right? We're for the most part, most of our farmers are 50-50. From a rotation, you look at total acres in the state, we're about, you know, 5.5 million acres of corn, 5.5 million acres of soybeans. So I think that rotation piece is important, because I think, and I think Sean's seeing this on the soybean side, where those heavy amounts of residues are really impacting the soybeans themselves. And then you bring it, and you get these higher yielding beans and the poor spread, then they're impacting the corn side. And I think it's something that's the magnitude's only going to get bigger and bigger as these yields keep moving higher and higher.
Well, and it's going to be a cumulative problem, right? I mean, so it's not like you can fix it one time and it just goes away. So Sean gave us some really cool data. And hopefully we can attach some of that data when we release that podcast of what they actually saw for yield penalty when that component was off. If you were going to give a recommendation for a grower to make a consideration, especially if we're really chasing yield either on corn or soybeans, what would you encourage growers to start looking at from a residue management practice? Obviously. Obviously paying attention to what's coming out of the back of the combine, right? But as far as other practice, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, that's a tough one because you don't want them to do anything that limits the yield of their crop, right? I want them to have a massive corn crop that produces a ton of residue because in many cases it has a lot of grain yield behind it. But yeah, I think it starts with the machine, right, and paying attention to that spread pattern. I know the new machines now there's a lot more controls, right, in terms of RPMs and those aspects coming out of the back of the machine. So just paying attention to that, if you're using different tillage practices, right, VTs or stuff like that. But also I think another important piece is some of the aspects in the spring, right? Do we need to,
that's where I was going.
Yeah.
Like what's the impact? Because it's not as simple as, we have residue. I either don't worry about it or worry about it.
Yeah.
What's the impact the next year was corn and soybean emergence, stand, vigor, root growth, free mineralization rates.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, just the planter itself, right? Is your planter handling, do you have the adequate equipment on your planters, whether it be, row cleaners or the downforce piece, right, that. But, I think we can take a lot of what we learned in these high residue cover crop systems, and I think a lot of that, pertains to what we're seeing on the residue side too. Are you more than likely probably seeing a lot more, especially in our state, a lot more sulfur deficiencies in these pockets, right, where you have heavy residue, or nitrogen deficiencies. That's something we saw even in heavy soybean residue plots in our areas. How is it impacting the emergence of the plants, right? Is the planter adequately, doing what it needs to maybe move some of that residue? And it's easier said than done to do that, because we see it, you'll see it in the field where you have corn that is, much smaller and it emerges late, right, and all those aspects. But yeah, looking at the nutrition piece, I think it's really important. But yeah, it's also really challenging too, because you don't want people to do anything in the crop that limits some of that too. So you kind of have to do what you can in terms of harvest and also at planting in the spring to account for it. But and there's some other aspects too. I think whether or not there's going to be some. I know in Indiana there's some more economical pieces where people, there's new companies in terms of looking at, industrial products, stuff like that, and like corn residue, right, and stover and harvesting stover, not, so much for, say, feed, but actually some industrial properties to it too. Is that maybe we always kind of were against that, right, in the past because of the nutrition that you're removing, but maybe is there a happy medium, right, where maybe there's a little bit more of an economic stream where you can pull some of that stover off, but also help maybe limit some of the negative impacts when we have high,
maybe 30% versus 95% of
exactly. Yeah.
No, that's good. Thinking about some of the things you've looked at in these high yield management practices, or even just overall, trying new things, whether it's starter or some foliar, do you see more consistent response? Everybody knows there are really good fields that are consistently good. Everybody knows there are poorer fields that are consistently below average. Do you see some of these practices working consistently across all of them, or do you see more of a response when you start getting into those better acres versus the poorer acres?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'll give you my, part of my extension training, right? You give me my extension answer.
It depends.
It depends, right?
The political answer.
I think they're different systems, right? And it depends on the practice too. So, some of the more challenging sites that we deal with, something like, starter fertilizer or just manage that nitrogen a little bit better. In East Indiana, right, if you're managing that nitrogen a little bit more efficiently and you're on your rate a little bit better, right, you got a lot more flexibility on, these fields here in West Lafayette with something like nitrogen than you would in those other fields. But you bring in, to the high yield piece. I do think there's a lot of piece when you get up to 280, 290, 300 bushel corn that you start teasing out some of these other practices that maybe, be a micronutrient, or maybe some of these high yielding sites, maybe we see higher disease pressure, right, in some of those areas, so then we get a little bit better response.
Things that weren't limiting are now limiting.
So it kind of always depends on what is limiting in my individual environment, and how do I tackle it. So I think both are kind of case scenarios where you may have in the low yielding environment and challenging environment, we see this a lot where this X, Y, and Z works a lot better in this environment, and we didn't see anything in this high yield environment.
Yeah.
But the high yield environment, we saw X, Y, and Z work, and we didn't see it work in this low yield environment.
Yep.
We talked quite a bit with Ignacio about some of the technology pieces, but part of his encouragement to us was to really think about like the evolution of our farms has to be variable rate fertility, variable rate nitrogen and stuff. And so it's funny because when you ask that question, my mind immediately goes to, well, what makes a bad field? Like why is that field bad?
Yeah.
And then I think about a lot of the people that we work with, we treat almost every field the same every year, right? So the bad field stays the bad field oftentimes because I don't feel like we necessarily
not fixing
go
the
in
pH
and
or
ask
something.
go in and ask what the problem is. I mean, sometimes you're limited by a soil type or something like that, but I think oftentimes we're not even asking ourselves, okay, why is that underperforming, and is there a way that I can, is there a way that I can correct it? I had a good friend that farms. I was standing in one of his fields and he was kind of teasing me. He happens to be a customer. He says, it's been my worst field 3 years in a row, and I thought, man, I wonder why we haven't pulled a soil sample out and asked, okay, what's going on in this field, the variability aspect.
Good point.
So thinking about crop nutrition, so we've talked a lot about NP and K and sulfur. That's been talked about the whole time we've been here, but talk about the importance of the other nutrients, right? So we've gotten a pretty good understanding of those.
All the stuff that gets forgot about.
Yeah.
I think they're important. I think the challenge with when you're in a state like Indiana and these I states, right? A lot of our soils inherently have a lot of these secondary nutrients, but a lot of times with some of the micronutrients, right? A lot of times take nitrogen, for example. We need nitrogen on corn regardless of where you are in the state. But, some of these other nutrition pieces, right, we have very, localized needs in a lot of cases. You touched on that with the zinc piece, right, and some of these high soil test phosphorus sites or these more sandier sites that we need that. We have a lot of areas in the state, northern Indiana, that we struggle with manganese as well. And you think about the pH, we have some farmers that, purposely try to keep their pH on the low side to help with that manganese availability in those sites. So a lot of times they tend to be a little bit more localized in understanding them. They're very important, but, more so important in those sites. And a lot of times there's reasons for that. We have some sites in southwest Indiana, some of the first times I've really seen magnesium deficient corn.
Really?
And it was pretty severe down in southwest, so, in those sites, they up here we likely don't need magnesium, but down there, you're seeing foliar, deficiency symptoms of confirmed magnesium deficiency, right? So I think, it all stems back, they're really important. I'm always kind of curious, as genetics change over time and yields keep going higher, one aspect is that, crop nutritional needs keep going up, but, the genetics keep getting a lot better too in terms of their efficiency and how they utilize these nutrients too. But, a lot of those secondary nutrients, especially for us in the state, a lot of times it's doing the legwork to try and understand in your own environment, in your own region, is this an issue and do we need to address it?
I really like that because so often, like whether we're here talking to someone in Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska, you can't just blanket apply whether it's a biological or product, right? Yeah. We need to know what our limiting factor is in our soil. And so is it zinc? Is it magnesium? Is it manganese? So I think that's a really good call out. We don't want to make these broad applications of magnesium because you probably don't need them depending on where you're at, right? So I think figuring out what's your specific limiting factor, because everybody's got something, right? Yeah. We all just need to know what it is on our farm. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, the encouragement too. So we've gotten the opportunity to interview NCGA winners, National Corn Growers, winners, and the thing that's interesting is how often the traditional farm will apply nutrients once, oftentimes ahead of the season. And a lot of those guys that are really pushing the envelope on yield, they're querying the crop over and over and over again throughout the growing season. And so they're constantly trying to find that that limiting factor and then address it. So
Yeah.
as we encourage people to think about increasing yield on their farm, maybe a simple question is, should we ask our crop what it needs more than once and assume we know the answer,
Yep.
Yeah, and I've worked with a lot of our co-op agronomists and a lot of our, independent agronomists across the state, and they've even made that comment, just in general, how people have gone from, a lot of people were on 4-year cycles for soil testing. Now, a lot of times it's 2-year cycles, and then a lot of people are 1-year cycles. So there's a lot of movement to, we see that a lot in the state with tissue sampling and soil testing, right? They're doing everything they can. They want to, keep gauging that plant and where it's at and you want to, really kind of feed it the best you can. Some of the highest yields that you'll see, and even in some of our trials, are fertigated, those subsurface drip or fertigation, right, where we can kind of meet those needs throughout the entire season, and that's where you kind of push it. So, I'm
glad you brought that up, because we've been encouraging growers to think about that, which is, so you're willing to spend, $150 or $200 in fertility, but you're not even sure if you're putting it in the right spot, right? Exactly. I mean, it just seems like such a radical expense. I mean, we've been pushing or encouraging growers to think about that at least every 2 years, but I think you could make the case that the $10 to $12 you spend on the soil test is you're probably more than making that back just by ensuring proper distribution.
Yeah, especially
some of the biggest yield responses I've seen in our trials are just taking something like P or K, and it was deficient in that area, and we put the necessary P and K in that area.
Yeah. Back to the basics, right?
Yep.
Dan, my final question for you is, as with all the cool stuff you get to research, all the calls you get from growers, and most of those calls are probably, hey, I have a problem in my field. What are there any stressors out there that you think we need to take more seriously, that you commonly see that maybe we're not addressing or thinking about, whether it's, nutrient placement or timing, early season growth, nitrogen stress, micronutrient stress? Is there something that you commonly see that we need to take more seriously?
It's a great question.
I'd say that one example was from this year, and I'll lean on a little bit on the environment piece, but understanding this more is these swings, right? And it's not so much that it's too hot or too cold, but it's the fluctuations, right? The fluctuations of going from really cool temps to ramping up to hot temps and then ramping back, and that's something we're seeing. We saw a lot of that this year, and I had a lot of calls on many different aspects of just a crop doing weird stuff in these areas, and a lot of times we kind of, many cases we may not know. We kind of make educated guesses and based on what we understand, but a lot of it came back to these big swings, right? And we see in many cases, big one is rapid growth syndrome, right, in corn, and some of these vegetative kind of oddities that you'll see. But these big swings, right, and we're seeing that more and more, just the variability of the environment, right? You look at it across the entire season, and, well, it was average, right?
Right.
But there's big swings, right, that we have, and so understanding plant physiological responses to that, I think, and how maybe some genetics can tolerate better than other, I do think that's an important piece. As well, and that's something that I think a lot of farmers are paying attention to in terms of just these environmental stressors. I do think and Ignacio's done kind of querying on some of this too, is these nighttime temperatures, right? And these high nighttime temperatures. That was one of the biggest comments I had at field days this summer from farmers. Was like, what are these high nighttime temps doing to my crop, right? And I think Ignacio did a review paper where they found there really isn't much out there. We have some ideas of what's happening, right? And so you think about intercanopy temperature, and I'm real curious too, and the temperature and kind of that pocket of the environment near the ear, right? And how that may be influencing that plant, and how it changes with swings and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of the environmental pieces that are really challenging to study, right? Which makes it a little bit more of a headache. But I do think those have been eye-opening, and some of the aspects of what farmers have been asking about a lot.
Boy, Dan, you really got me thinking. That's probably a bad thing. Sean's aware of that. I mean, I remember once, man, you think about going from 30s to 20s, the impact on the microclimate. You think of higher populations. I guess I've never really once thought about the fluctuating temperature, especially with the ear leaf. We got the source in the sink and the biggest contributor of assimilate. What's that fluctuation if you have a 30-inch row with a low population and you get your nighttime? What's the impact of that swing? I've never really thought of that. That's cool.
Yeah, having whether we can start putting temperature sensors right near the ear, and seeing how something like row spacing, seed rate, all these, how does it either respond more or less, or does it help with the fluctuations or these nighttime temps, and how does that impact grain fill and all these aspects, right? So I think that was one thing that really stood out to me this year.
That's cool.
You made the comment earlier, Andrew, that we can't treat all of our acres the same, right? Especially not across wide geographies, and then. When you're talking about those stressors, especially the wild fluctuations in weather, I know for me, thinking about the availability of drones and being able to be more in-season responsive, whether that's through short corn that we have more access to or just even full-statured hybrids, makes me think of some of these tools that I don't know where I sit on them, but some of the seaweed extracts and some of the hormones that we can use to impact or trigger responses in plants. It makes me wonder. We went through, I think, 10 or 11 days in a row where the nighttime temp stayed above 80 degrees. And, you sit there and go, maybe with some research, maybe that would have been a time that if we saw that forecast coming, we could have gone out and made an application.
Deployed some seaweed extract or something with those metabolites.
Something to encourage that crop to respond. Sometimes I think we act a little helpless, like we have no control over this stuff, and we don't, right? I mean, we can't turn the AC on when it gets too hot.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder if some of this technology we have can't, we get a little more prescriptive and a little more responsive. I think it'd be valuable. My final question, thoughts on drones? What have you seen? Seeing guys responsive with them and benefits? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, on the spray side for sure. That's something that's really taken off in the state. You think about fungicides, and there's a lot of cautious with that, and you got to be careful and know what you're doing, right? But I do think in terms of that aspect, right, and fungicides have become more and more important. Their demands for them much higher. But if you don't have a high clearance sprayer, you got to wait and try and rely on an airplane, right? It's just an additional tool to be able to get that out. And in some cases, maybe in these more, southern Indiana, right, where the fields are not perfectly square and flat and you have a lot of trees, right? So the spraying piece has been the biggest thing that, and I know you'll have Tommy on today, and he can talk a lot more about that than I can. But I think that's been the biggest piece that I've seen it. We've started to actually do some cover crop work to it too, so interseeding cover crops with them. I think they work pretty well for doing that. So we have some farmers that are doing that. We have some trials that we're doing that as well. We've do a lot of work with imagery. I think there's potential there. It's just trying to figure it out. You take something like nitrogen, right, and the challenge that we've often found with some of the aerial imagery pieces is that it's in many cases too difficult for us to pick up on differences to inform a decision from the farmer, right? We can pick up really good differences at R1, growth stage. The farmer goes, well, I've already did everything.
Too little, too late, yep.
So I want to know when the corn's V5, do I need to adjust things or change things? And we found, I think they're only going to get better in that aspect, but we found that, many cases that, we just can't pick up on those differences. But I think, it's only going to keep evolving. I plan a lot of research plots for engineers who are constantly developing new sensors, biodegradable soil sensors, nitrate sensors. I mean, they're constantly trying to find
that's cool stuff.
Something. So I get to see it. I get to see robots run through our plots and stuff like that. And so I see that the development and where they're going, and they actually allow us to give some insight to, hey, you need to go look at it this way or that way, or a farmer might be more influential to look at it this way or that way. So so I see it, and you think about how the rapidness of technology today, and it's only a matter of time for some of these things, and they're only going to keep getting better. You think about models and crop models, and you bring in the AI world and all that, and what they can do with data analysis and the sensing capabilities. We have folks doing LiDAR across our plots, like map entire corn plants. What is the implications of that as it gets cheaper and more available too. So it's I see it in our trials, and I work with a lot of these folks, so it's only a matter of time for a lot of that, and it's only going to keep getting better.
Yeah.
You're one of the first things I wrote down that you said earlier, and I'm going to steal this and start using it, is the acceleration of innovation. I really like that. That should be a marketing slogan for
there's his shirt.
For some tech company. But we'll let you get back to your day. We got a fun question we ask on the backside of our recording, which is you've had a really cool career. You've been a lot of places. Reflect, if you would, on maybe something that you feel like has had a significant impact, something really cool you've done.
Yeah. A career, that's funny, thinking about it, right, man? I'm still, in my early 30s. So
well, hopefully we're asking you this question again in like a decade if people are still willing to listen to us.
Exactly. I think things that are new and different is what I enjoy, right? Because it's also something that the farmers enjoy. And not that because you two are sitting here, right? I think short stature corn has been one of the funnest things that I've been able to be a part of, because it's different, right? And we've had a lot of plots and be able to present data, and you can see farmers they're interested in it.
His head's already big enough, Dan.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's like 2 feet tall.
Clip this out. But it's different, and when it's different for me, right, it opens up a lot of these doors and the questions that maybe are more fundamental questions, but they haven't been looked at in this scenario. And also the farmers, right? They see something that is pretty drastically different out in the field. And it's like, oh my goodness, this is a lot different. So then they can
how's it yield? What do you think?
Exactly. So then they get really interested in it as well. So I think the short stature corn piece has been really fun. I think that's only going to continue to evolve as we move forward as well. But just the genetic by management piece has been really interesting to me. Just fairly diving into how hybrids differ in the way they grow and their physiology, and then how that relates to management, right? We're doing a lot of work with hybrids with, define different root systems, right? Do they need to be managed differently with these different root systems? And we have some indications that maybe they do, right? And so that kind of stuff is fun, where you're finding different things. You're maybe pushing the envelope. You're helping farmers maybe answer questions that maybe some questions they didn't know they had until they see it. So those are the fun things that I've enjoyed as well, and I think I haven't been in this very long, so as well. So I think things are only going to get more, I would say, crazy and innovative and very interesting as we keep moving forward. So I'm looking forward to the future. It kind of scares me a little bit, but I do think I can't imagine where things will be in 20 years, but yeah, those are just a couple examples that, those are a couple pieces I just really enjoy, and I've enjoyed a lot, working with, because of, how different and how new they are.
You're not quite the old curmudgeon that Sean Castillo and I are. Yeah. We're about the same age, I think.
Yeah, Sean's the elder statesman of the department.
We were noting the wisdom he has on his chin. So reflecting on your comment about short corn, the neat part is it's funny because it's different, but it's the same thing. But for some reason, it triggers this response in a grower to say, maybe I should think about this differently. And it's kind of funny because we've gotten to be a part of that process since even pre-commercial. And it's interesting because one of the things that gets said a lot is it's still just corn, right? So I mean, it's still going to respond to the environment and management in similar fashions. Obviously, it's different, but it certainly feels like it's a moment in time when growers first interact with it, they start asking like intuitive questions, and it's funny because it's like it's the same crop you had a year ago. It's just a shorter plant, but really appreciate that. We want to make sure that we express our gratitude. The whole team here is so passionate, and I think that drives innovation. It drives curiosity. It drives pushing people to think better. And for us to get to do this, it helps our audience and our listeners to think really well. And so just super appreciative of the hard work that you and your team do. It's super fun to us to get to be part of it. Helps us think better, but I know it's encouraging a lot of people to do that as well. So really appreciate that.
Definitely.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you guys. I mean, I always say that, I'm still young in my career. I always joke, I took over for Bob Nielsen, right? And I joke for him that he was in this job for 40 years, and when I got hired in this job, I was 29 years old.
Wow.
So you think about where you have to go. So, I enjoy just, kind of being a fly on a wall and a sponge and taking all these in and the conversations, right? And not just having conversations with my colleagues in the university, but, having industry, colleagues that I can work with, getting their idea. And then I have, independent consultants that I can get, the amount of farmers that we work with too. I mean, some of the best research ideas, I tell the farmers this comes from them, either griping or complaining or, or saying, hey, have you ever looked at this or not? So I think that's what makes it fun is
they're absolutely some of the best innovators on the planet are the men and women doing it on a daily basis. But Dan, our show is called A Penny for Your Thoughts. At the end of it, I like to cash in my penny. You got to be efficient because I got some good notes. Ladders game I got to get to.
Yeah, true. To polish up your Jenga skills. Yeah. No, I had some wonderful key takeaways that I know our listeners will benefit from. I always enjoy listening to Dan, despite me being 10 years older than him. Still learning today. So learned a lot from Dan. My key takeaways. I really like how Dan approached the starter fertilizer conversation. Starter helps us get us through those teenage years, and thinking about some of the yield responses. That's always good, obviously, but one of the most consistent responses we've always seen. And Dan did a good job of bringing this up, is we typically see about 0.5% to 1% drier at harvest, right, when we're looking at moisture. And so as we continue to have this maturity shift across the Corn Belt, growers continue to push for later maturity corn to maximize kernel weight in yield. That 0.5% to 1%, and you mentioned it, Dan, I mean, at times that can pay for the starter alone, let alone the yield response, right? Yeah. So I think we'll get to a point where as technology increases, as more growers have access to that, whether it's in furrow 2x2 or even potentially both, I think we'll get to a point where a lot more growers will begin using it again or start using it for the first time. The second one, the seeding depth conversation is always critical. I'm love what you said. You like 2 inches, but there are times where we got to search for moisture to decrease the variable emergence, right? And so you have no problem going down to 3 inches. You like 2 inches, but if we're searching for moisture in even emergence, even seed imbibition, water imbibition, we can go down to 3 inches comfortably. I can't imagine you'd recommend 4 inches, but it can do it, right?
And only in certain circumstances 3 inches. And we didn't necessarily touch on the root development too, right? In corn, right? You get real shallow with seed, and you get the lower root development and just the anchoring in the plant, and it can be off. But
stick with 2 inches, but and then obviously if you do have to go down to 3 inches, take into consideration your soil texture, right? We're not going to want to go to 3 inches on some heavy clays, right?
Exactly.
And then the third one, I really like you talking about. You talk a lot about sulfur deficiency, but zinc deficiency is something that I think is going to become more of an issue. And you had some really good points. Situations we might see zinc deficiency, high phosphorus. Some of the soils with high phosphorus, you might see zinc deficiency, higher pH, obviously. And then the understanding of what zinc deficiency looks like. You mentioned the wider white bands along that mid rib. Looking at that versus sulfur, I think it can be tricky. But you look for the thicker, wider stripes across that leaf tissue. And then finally, the one I really like is thinking about. You do a lot of cool work looking at the rate and duration of grain fill. And Sean had a good question regarding, if we're a grower, obviously we want the rate and duration of grain fill to be maximized, right? We want the most kernels, but we also want the heaviest kernels. And so how do we do that? And so your recommendations, maintain healthy leaf tissue. Obviously, photosynthesis is going to drive a lot of this. We need green tissue. We need late season plant health. And then nutrient availability. Again, going back to this maturity thing, we got products that we're really pushing the maturity. Iowa State and Ceterius have done some cool research showing that these newer products need more nitrogen later in the growing season. So I think there's something to this whole maturity shift. We can maximize yields by thinking about how we, increase kernel weight, but it comes down to, like you said, Dan, green tissue, nutrient availability, and plant health.
I'm having a thought as you went through that piece, and several things in my mind went to growers that we've had fuller season hybrids with that maybe haven't realized the yield. And it's almost like a light bulb just went off in my head where I'm going, maybe we need to ensure that if we're going to use those tools, the grower's responsive in that manner, right? I mean,
it's kind of like starter isn't finisher.
Inherently, a 119-day corn may not produce more yield if you're not doing the right types of behaviors in season to support it.
Absolutely.
So that's really good. But sorry, that was like a random, Hey,
that's the type of stuff I think that's beneficial for these conversations, right?
Yep.
It's these spur of the moment conversations that hopefully help someone think about that. I mean, if you had it go off, how often we have these conversations, I guarantee someone else will have that go off.
Yeah, well,
so that's good.
And just thinking through a grower, right? If you're going to sit and advise someone to consider moving from 112-day to 116-day corn, the follow-up to that conversation should be these products need more nutrients later in the season. Are you willing to be responsive to that on your farm? If not, maybe we shouldn't be using those tools because we're not inherently getting any more yield if we don't do the right types of activities. But anyways, I feel like our teasers are challenging because all of our guests
this one actually
who's
might
coming
be
in next. So
this will be our first Purdue guest that isn't a repeat.
That's true.
So I'm looking forward. So the teaser for the next episode is we are going to have some phenomenal conversations around herbicides, some potential new and continued discussion around herbicide resistance. But we're also going to talk about, application technology. And so maybe how those two worlds merge. Looking forward to it.
It'll be good. Dan, once again, thank you so much. Excellent as always. Thank you for all of your hard work. And thank you for hosting us.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Dan.
Dan.
Very much. Yeah.